Good afternoon. My name is Alister Chapman. I'm a DP cinematographer from the UK. And in the next 45 minutes, I'm going to give you a run-through of the cameras that I myself personally shoot with. And that includes Sony's A7S, FS5, FS7, FS7 Mark II, F55, and F5. So what do? Well, I shoot all kinds of things. I shoot a lot of severe weather, tornadoes, hurricanes, things like that. I go up to the Arctic, north of the Arctic Circle, and shoot the Northern Lights. But I also shoot drama, documentaries. I have my own production company. I've had a few commissions from National Geographic and Discovery. So to give you a little taste of the things that I shoot, I'm going to roll a video in a moment. And this video was shot with a variety of cameras. In fact, almost all of the cameras that I'm going to talk about today were used in the video. I'm not going to tell you which camera was used for which shot just yet. If you want to know which camera did which shot, you'll have to wait to the end. So let's roll the video to get the show started. Thank you. OK, so these are the cameras that were used to shoot that sequence. A7, FS5, FS7, F55, F5. So quite a wide range of cameras and quite a wide range of different shooting scenarios. So let's take a look a little bit more closely at some of these cameras. One of the big things about all of them is they share a lot of common features. So they all have the ability to shoot using Sony's XAVC codec, with a large Super 35mm sensor, giving you that film-like shallow depth of field. They can all shoot using S-Log2 or S-Log3. That's a log gamma curve that allows you then to capture 14 stops of range from the sensor. They have S-Gamut, S-Gamut3, and S-Gamut3 Cine. These are large color spaces, bigger than your traditional recording color space, so you get a richer, greater range of color. They're all UHD, 4K, or higher resolution, and they have adaptable lens mounts. Now, in a bit more detail, so adaptable lens mounts, a bit more detail about the lens mounts. The A7S, the FS5, and the FS7 all use Sony's E-mount. And this is a very popular mount, growing system now that's being supported by third parties. But one of the great things about E-mount is we can put adapters onto it and put on almost any lens that you want. And in fact, I'm yet to find a lens that I would like to use on these cameras, but not been able to actually physically put them on the camera. There's so many different adapters available. The F5 and F55 cameras have a very slightly different system. It's called an FZ mount. When you buy the camera, it's fitted with a PL mount, but you can take the PL mount off and again put adapters on there. Companies like Metabones make adapters for Canon lenses and things like that. So with E-mount, we have all the Sony E-mount lenses. You have the Sony Alpha lenses as well with the LA-EA4 adapter. And then both for FZ and also for E-mount, you have a whole range of adapters for Nikon, for Canon, for PL, just about any lens that you want, you can put on these cameras. The smallest of the cameras that we're going to look at, looking at these cameras, at the bottom perhaps of the range is the A7 cameras, the A7S Mark II and the A7R Mark II. A7R, the R stands for resolution, and this is a 42 megapixel camera, but it does shoot really good 4K using the XAVC codec. The A7S is one of my favorite cameras, and both of these cameras have a very compact and ergonomic design. The UHD recording, 3840 by 2160, that's the standard for for 4K television. The XAVC-S codec, 120 frames per second in HD, so you can shoot slow motion with these cameras in very high quality, and a full frame sensor with 5-axis in-camera stabilization. Now, the in-body image stabilization IBIS system can be combined with a lens that has optical stabilization as well, so you get 2 stages of stabilization, and that means you can get a lot of gimbal-like shots handheld. You don't necessarily always need a gimbal, and it's really good for running around, shooting on the move, shooting from cars or bikes and things like that. Now, the A7S, the S in A7S stands for sensitivity, and this really is the king of low light. The picture here gives you a clue as to which of the shots in the video were shot with the A7S. But 12 megapixels on a full-frame sensor means that each pixel is very, very big, so they're really, really good at capturing a lot of light. And that's how we get this sensitivity. Fewer pixels, but making them bigger, better sensitivity, and also really good wide and high dynamic range. So the thing, though, with these cameras is even when you have a very sensitive sensor with these big pixels, you do still need light. There's a lot of talk, a lot of people talk about, oh, my camera's got this huge ISO, so I can shoot in the dark. Well, and the reality is that if you want nice pictures, you need contrast. So we need some light to create that contrast between light and dark. So even with a very sensitive camera, you do still need a lot of light. And if you do raise the ISO, you do raise the gain, you'll get an increase in noise. That's inevitable. You can't do anything about that. Now, something that's talked about a lot with these cameras is something called the native ISO. The native ISO is really, really important because that's the place with the camera where you get the best performance. Now, the native ISO is the point in the camera where no extra gain is added or taken away. And why is that so important? This diagram here represents, on the left-hand side, the scene that we are shooting going from dark to bright. Then the next block along represents what the sensor and the camera can see. The third block is what we are doing in terms of gain, adding gain or taking gain away, and then the final block is our recorded signal. Now, at the native ISO, everything is in perfect harmony. You're taking the red line at the top is the point where the sensor clips, the sensor overloads, so you take that as your peak recording level, and then the blue line at the bottom is something called the noise floor. The noise floor is really important because basically at the noise floor, anything that's darker than that point will be so faint and hidden by the noise from the sensor that you won't be able to see it. So in a perfect world, we want to shoot with no extra gain so that we are mapping the bottom of the sensor's sensitivity right on the noise floor to our black, to our darkest possible recording level, and then the clipping point, the point where the sensor overloads, to our peak, and that gives us the greatest possible dynamic range. So if we want to shoot for HDR or we want to shoot with log, this is the setup we need to have in the camera to get the very best performance. But this is where we are having 0 dB gain. We are not adding any extra gain. We are not taking any away. Now, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. If we add gain, 6 dB of gain, 6 dB is the same as 1 f-stop. If we increase the ISO, if we were to double the ISO of the camera, make it twice the ISO of its native ISO, so if the camera is 2000 ISO native, we were to make it 4000 ISO, that's the same as adding 6 dB gain. This is what happens. The clipping point of the sensor is amplified. Now, gain is like turning up the volume on a radio. If you're driving your car down the road and the radio, the signal gets a bit hissy because you're in a poor reception area, and you turn up the gain, well, what happens to that volume? Well, the audio gets louder, but so too does the hiss, the pop, the crackle, and all the undesirable stuff. So when we add gain, we are amplifying, we are turning the volume up, And what happens is our peak clipping point of the sensor, well, we can no longer record that because that's way, way, way too big a signal. Maybe our mid-range, the green line, that does get brighter. That now becomes our 100%. So the picture does get a bit brighter, but at the same time, the noise increases because we are turning up the volume. So yes, we get a brighter picture, but that comes at the price of more noise and also a reduction in dynamic range. We only now have about half of the dynamic range we started with because we're no longer able to record the top bit of the information coming from the sensor because of the extra amplification. That would be too big a signal. So we don't want to add gain if we want maximum dynamic range. So the area at the top is lost, and our noise becomes brighter, so the picture appears noisy. And we don't actually see anything extra out of the shadows because of that noise floor of the sensor. Now, what happens if we take gain away? So this is a negative gain situation. Well, the clipping point of the sensor doesn't change. The sensor's still going to overload at the same point, but we're now taking gain away. We're turning it down. So what happens, actually, is that we never actually reach 100% in our recording. The negative gain doesn't allow us to do that. So we lose some dynamic range. Also, in the shadows, we take that noise floor down below our black point, so we lose information in the shadows. We can't see some of the details we did before. There's a small loss of dynamic range. So this is why whenever you're shooting for a wide dynamic range, for HDR, for log, the camera has to be at its native ISO. Now, the problem with native ISO is that many cameras will actually have multiple native ISOs because different gamma curves give different brightnesses. Now, ISO is not actually sensitivity. ISO is actually the rating that you put in your light meter to get the correct exposure, but that is a slightly different thing from sensitivity itself. So brightness as well is not exposure. Video cameramen, people like myself brought up with traditional video cameras, are told that we measure exposure by looking at brightness. We would often use zebras to measure how bright the picture is, and in your mind that becomes the equivalent of exposure. So skin tones at 70% is a brightness level, but it's not an exposure level. It doesn't tell you how much light is going on the sensor. Exposure is putting the correct amount of light on the sensor for the best performance. So what we want is 0 dB gain, the native ISO, with the right amount of light going on the sensor to get the very best results. And because of the fact that different gamma curves in cameras make the picture brighter or darker, you're going to see the equivalent ISO rating of the camera go up and down depending on the gamma curve that you've chosen. Sony's FS5, as an example, has 4 different native ISOs. In S-Log, it's currently 3200 ISO. There is a change to that coming. It's going to be 2000 ISO. You'll be able to select that in the future. But with standard gammas, it's 1000 ISO. With cine gammas, it's 640 ISO. They're all actually the same sensitivity, but because the gamma curve changes how bright the image is, you have an ISO change. Now, this is very, very confusing because to remember the native ISO, you've got to remember lots of different numbers depending on the gamma curve that you're using. So I would suggest to you that actually using dB of gain is going to be a safer, better thing to do. If you use dB of gain, it's really easy. You only have to remember one number, which is 0. 0 dB gain is the native ISO, and it's really as simple as that. ISO is cool. It makes you sound like a cinematographer, but it does actually confuse some people because they don't really understand the way it works. So do consider using dB of gain instead. Now, coming back to the cameras themselves, the FS5, which I mentioned a moment ago, super 35mm sensor, 14 stops of dynamic range at its native ISO, low-cost media recording onto SD cards, raw recording option, and all kinds of really nice things with this camera. I really like this camera because it's very small and it's very light. A few years ago, I came here and I did a presentation, and I was saying how wonderful it was to be able to take a camera like the FS7, put it in my carry-on baggage, and fly anywhere in the world with it. Well, now I have the FS5, I can put that in my hand luggage, as well as my laptop power supply, some hard drives, a couple of extra lenses, and fly around the world with it, because this camera is so small and compact. It has this wonderful variable ND filter, which I'll talk about in a minute, but the ergonomics of this camera are great. It falls into your hand really nicely. It's really balanced, really pleasant camera to shoot with. But what it isn't, and this is important, in my opinion, is a digital cinematography camera. The digital cinema cameras, which I'll come on to in a bit, they have things like lookup tables, exposure index mode, and things like that make them much easier to work with when you're shooting with log or with RAW. This camera doesn't have those tools. It has a gamma assist for the viewfinder, but it's not as sophisticated when you're shooting with log. So it's not really a digital cinema camera. It can produce stunning results, don't get me wrong, shooting with log, but you've got to work a little bit harder with it. But what it really is an amazing run-and-gun large sensor camera. It fits in your hand really nicely. Ergonomically, it's great. You can put Sony's E-mount power zooms on there, so you can zoom in and out with a servo zoom. You have autofocus that works. It's really good. You have a variable ND filter, picture cache, slow-mo, shoot 240 frames per second, very easily onto SD cards. So I really enjoy shooting with this camera when I'm moving around, being very active and traveling. You also have the option with the camera, as well as to shoot log, to shoot with RAW. And that gives you a 12-bit linear RAW output that you record on a suitable external recorder, maybe a Convergent Design 7Q, or an Atomos, one of the many Atomos options that there are available to you now. RAW gives you many benefits. It gives you a higher bit rate than the camera can record internally. Most of the RAW recorders can also convert to ProRes, so it gives you more codec options as well. It really is a nice thing to do with the FS5. I think it's a really valuable option for that camera. Now, other cool tricks we can do with the FS5, because it's a very capable camera. You have an instant center crop mode, so if you want to use Super 16 lenses on the camera, you can via center crop. But you also have what, for me, is an even better mode called Clear Image Zoom. And that allows you to zoom in and out electronically with any lens, up to 2 times in HD and 1.5 times in UHD. Now, Clear Image Zoom is not your run-of-the-mill digital zoom. For many cameramen, me included, the word digital zoom is a bit like a swear word because it means horrible picture quality. But Clear Image Zoom uses a database of textures. The camera recognizes what you're shooting, classifies that texture, and applies the electronic processing according to what you're shooting. So if you're shooting something soft and furry, like a cat, why can't we have a dog for a change? Like a cat, it will apply soft processing. If you were shooting architecture, the processing would be a bit harder, more sympathetic to what you're shooting. Plus, if you're shooting in HD, do remember it's a 4K sensor, so cropping into that is virtually lossless anyway. So you get the ability to zoom in 2 times seamlessly. If you're using a Sony power zoom, the zoom rocker, you press on the zoom rocker, the optical part zooms in. When you reach the end of the optical, the electronic clear image zoom takes over, carries on that 2 times. So the kit lens that comes with the camera, the 18 to 105 millimeter lens, effectively becomes an 18 to 210 zoom lens, and that's a really respectable zoom range for a large sensor camera. Now, another nice thing about the FS5 is the built-in picture profiles. These allow you to change the way the picture looks or to suit different shooting situations. There are 6. What you see is what you get profiles built in, and these all give you very different looks. They're all built in from the factory. You haven't got to fiddle around with them if you don't want to. You can just call them up, look in the viewfinder. The picture you see in the viewfinder is what's recorded. Then on top of that, there are 3 log picture profiles for shooting with log or with RAW. If you're shooting with log with this camera, you would use picture profile number 7, S-Log2, to shoot RAW. Gives you the correct gain settings and everything else in the camera for RAW. And there will soon be added a 10th picture profile, number 10. This is coming in a free firmware update, end of June, early July, something like that. And that will add the ability to shoot HDR directly. So you'll have hybrid log gamma coming out of the camera with Rec 2020 color, plug it into your HDR-compatible TV, and you'll have HDR immediately. That means you can produce an HDR production just by doing a cuts-only edit. There's no need to grade that material. And in fact, there is an example of some of the material ungraded on the booth just over there. So do go and take a look. It looks really impressive. So looking at a couple of these picture profiles in a bit more detail. So on the left here, we have the camera's standard default settings. And on the right is picture profile number 2. Picture profile number 2 is designed to mimic a DSLR. It gives you that crunchy, high contrast image that many DSLR cameras produce, and also very highly saturated, very rich colors. And if you look at the right-hand image, if you look at the shadows on the far right of the image, you'll see they're much darker, much deeper than the standard settings. But when you do have a more contrasty on-screen image, that does generally mean you are capturing a smaller dynamic range. Small dynamic range, high contrast, big dynamic range, low contrast. So if you look at that right-hand image, you'll see that the highlights on the flower and on the tabletop, they're not quite as good as they are with the standard settings because of that limited dynamic range. But the colors are richer. Look at the apples, much more saturated with picture profile number 2. So if you want that straight over the camera, out of the camera, high contrast DSLR look, picture profile number 2 will deliver that for you. Now looking at this picture profile 6. This is one I use a lot, and this uses a different type of gamma curve to the standard settings called a cine gamma. And it also uses the camera's cinema color matrix. It's designed to give a more film-like look to your pictures. And if we look at the skin tones of the girls in the chart, in the picture here, you'll see they're a little bit more rounded, a little bit more subtle. You also have slightly higher dynamic range. If you look at the highlights on the flower, on the right-hand side, there's a lot more detail, a lot more texture in those bright petals, and also the shadows have just as much information, so we have a greater highlight range. It's also worth noting the color of the apples. The color is actually very slightly different. It's not just an intensity change. The color is more film-like. It is a nice-looking profile, gives you a bigger dynamic range, handles difficult lighting situations really well, and this tends to be my go-to profile for most of what I shoot. It actually grades really nicely too. So, moving on. Actually, before I do, cine gammas, they are slightly darker than 709. That's how you get a bigger dynamic range. You record white a little bit lower in level to make space for a bigger dynamic range above it. So if you are shooting with the cine gammas to get the very best results, I recommend that you set your zebras to 60% for skin tones rather than the usual 70%. Just expose them a little bit darker, they will look much nicer. And white, so a white piece of paper, the white patch on the chart here, would be recorded at 75 to 80% rather than the more common 90%. That will give you then much better highlights, better dynamic range, and a really nice picture. So, as I've mentioned already, FS5 is getting picture profile number 10 for direct HDR. We're also going to get 2020 color space, so the camera will be able to capture a greater range of colors than it can when it's set to Rec 709. And it allows us to plug the camera directly into that HDR TV for wonderful HDR with no grading. Hybrid log gamma was actually developed jointly by the BBC and NHK, and in Europe this gamma curve is actually gaining great popularity for our fledgling HDR services. The BBC are already testing it via their online iPlayer platform. It's designed to be backwards compatible to a degree, at least, with 709 and our normal gamma curves. So you don't need any special monitors, any special viewfinders, or anything else to shoot with this. And this is why this is so good in a camera like the FS5, because you'll be able to shoot HDR and monitor in SDR using the existing viewfinder, your existing standard dynamic range monitors. You don't need to buy anything extra to shoot HDR. Right, the ND filter. This, for me, is one of the best features of this camera. It is a variable ND filter. It's a real, genuine ND filter that becomes darker and clearer. It's not a polarizer or anything like that. It doesn't polarize the light. It's not an electronic trick. It's electronically controlled, but it is a genuine ND filter. And it completely changes the way you shoot. because it allows you to control your aperture, your exposure very, very precisely. It's completely smooth. So that means that you can use the lens's aperture, the iris, to set your depth of field and then control your exposure with the ND. Traditionally, aperture was your main way of controlling exposure. That's how you got your exposure just right. But now, the ND filter can do that, leaving the aperture free to be your depth of field control. And that's how I tend to work with this camera now. I set my depth of field with the aperture, then set the exposure with the ND filter. It's also really good for dealing with situations where the light is changing a lot. A really good scenario is shooting an interview outside on a cloudy day, and the sun is coming and going from behind those clouds. Well, with an ordinary traditional video camera, you would ride the aperture to even out the exposure. But when you do that, your depth of field is going to increase and decrease as you open and close the aperture. So you go to the edit suite, you cut and you edit that interview, and it looks really different shot to shot because the depth of field is changing. In some shots, the background's in focus. In other shots, it's out of focus. The variable ND filter, which can be controlled automatically, you can have auto ND, use that instead. The depth of field remains absolutely constant, even out the exposure, and it will edit much, much better, much more nicely. Once you've used a camera with the variable ND filter, going back to a traditional ND filter wheel is a little bit painful, actually. Fortunately, though, Sony have also included the variable ND filter in their new model, the FS7 II. This is an upgrade of the FS7. It doesn't replace the FS7. The FS7 will continue to be a current camera and a very capable camera. But the FS7 II brings some refinements to things like the viewfinder mount and things like that, and also the variable ND filter. FS7 cameras, they're 4K, UHD, and HD. You have XD-Cam and XAVC codecs. You also have the option to record in ProRes and RAW with the IFR5 extension unit. You have high-speed XQD media, so your file transfers are really quick, and that high-speed media is super reliable. You also have custom and Cine EI modes, the Cine EI mode being that digital cinema mode that makes this a proper digital cinema camera. Internally, we can shoot 180 frames per second continuously. Now, the FS5 can do 240 frames per second in bursts, thanks to its internal memory cache, but the FS7, because of the faster media, can record non-stop at 180 frames per second internally, and 240 frames per second if you have the external RAW recorder. You have both long GOP and iframe versions of the codec, so you can choose quality over file size, depending on what your needs are for your shoot. You have two HD SDI outputs. One always gives a clean output, suitable for an external recorder. The other one has your overlays, lookup tables, and things like that on it if you're using the Cine EI mode. Plus, we have a 4K HDMI output. Now, these two modes that the camera have are really important. Custom mode is your standard conventional shooting mode, where what you see in the viewfinder is what's recorded, what you see is what you get. Really simple, easy to use, the same as any other traditional video camera. Very straightforward. On top of that, though, we have this additional mode called Cine EI. And this uses something called exposure index to help you control exactly how you expose your log or raw footage. And that gives you greater flexibility in post-production because it gives you much more control over the levels of your noise, exposure, highlights, shadows, and things like that. So, LUT capabilities. When we're shooting in Cine EI with this digital cinema mode, the camera uses a lookup table to convert from the log that you're recording to something like 709, so the picture looks correct in the viewfinder. You can even create your own custom-made looks and load those into the camera to create film looks, maybe a blockbuster look, something like that. Load it into the camera, view it in the viewfinder, and have an approximation of the end result while you shoot. If you really want, you can actually record that LUT directly, bake in the look. Do remember, if you bake in the look, though, you're not shooting log anymore. You're now shooting whatever that LUT is. And if you do then decide you don't like that look, it's quite hard to unpick it. You may be better off shooting the log and adding the LUT in post-production. So Cine EI varies the brightness of the LUT. So when we're shooting in this mode, we're recording log at the native ISO of the camera, and then the EI mode changes how bright the LUT is. And the idea behind that is that we make the LUT darker deliberately. So if we're shooting at the camera's native ISO of 2000, if the EI, the exposure index, is 2000, then you get a one-to-one relationship between the viewfinder image and the recording. But what we normally do with these cameras, certainly what I do, is to lower the EI one stop down, going to 1000 EI. That makes the LUT one stop darker. So the viewfinder in my picture is one stop darker than it should be. Now, as a cameraman, when you look at your viewfinder and you see a dark picture, what do? Well, you normally open the aperture, or in this case, maybe decrease the ND, to put more light on the sensor to brighten the picture up. And that brings many benefits with log, because log doesn't have a highlight roll-off. And I'll come to that in a little bit, because this is something really important with log. I'll explain that in a minute. But basically, by shooting one stop brighter, after your grading and post-production, you get one stop less noise. One stop is 6 dB. That halves your noise. It's a significant reduction in noise, and it makes the pictures that you're shooting much easier to grade, much easier to work with. So what I like to do, in the middle we have our native EI, and the native EI we have 6 stops of overexposure range and 8 stops under. If I shoot with a low EI, let's say if this is an FS7, I go to 500 EI, which would be 2 stops, we'd be shooting on the far right example. I'd still have 4 stops of overexposure range, which is a lot. Excuse me. I would slightly decrease my overexposure range, but I would gain in my underexposure range. I'm going to have much deeper, richer, better shadows. And very often, that's what the audience will notice, rather than perhaps a little bit of a clipped highlight. So I will normally shoot 1 stop or 2 stops lower on my EI. Now, the FS7 can record RAW. If you put the IFR5 RAW recorder on the back of the camera, you can output a 12-bit linear RAW signal to an external recorder, again, Convergent Design Odyssey or Atomos Shogun, and that allows us to record RAW. RAW doesn't have a gamma curve. It is linear, Sony's RAW, so you have incredible amount of information in the highlights. Again, using the EI mode, bring that EI down 1 stop, expose like that, and you will have stunning highlight information, and that's going to be really, really good, especially for HDR productions. But if you're really serious about RAW, the cameras you should be considering are Sony's F5 or F55, because the RAW from these cameras, instead of being 12-bit, is 16-bit linear RAW. And that gives you a tremendous amount of picture information. And also, the way the RAW is recorded by the Sony RAW recorder is incredibly efficient. F5, F55, I have an F5. I've had that camera for 4 years, over 4 years now, and it really is my favorite camera to work with. You have amazing image quality. You have a huge range of codec choices with the camera. It can shoot slow motion up to 240 frames per second. You can do time-lapse with it. There's an ENG shoulder kit for it. And for this type of camera, relatively low power consumption. If you travel these days, if you fly anywhere, you'll know that taking batteries on aeroplanes is becoming harder and harder. So having a low power consumption becomes really important when you travel, because you don't need to take so many batteries with you. Now, it's a modular constructed camera, so it's very easy to upgrade. You can get a ProRes board that goes in these cameras to add ProRes as a recording option. It's had continuous updates throughout its life. We're currently on version 8 firmware, and there's a new version of firmware, firmware 9, coming for these cameras that will add even more. Version 8 added this option menu on the side, and it's one of the great things about the F55, makes it really easy to use, is the fact that you can access all the key functions of the camera externally from the side of the camera without having to go into the menu. Makes it much quicker and easier to work with. Frame rates that are coming in version 9. So the F55 camera, recording to the R7 RAW recorder, will get some additional frame rates. So with the R7, you can record 120p at 4K, but you'll also now get 72, 75, 90, and so on as additional frame rates. And the other thing that you'll get for the F55 and the F5 with version 9 is the ability to put a wireless adapter on the side of the camera that will give you streaming and proxy options as well. So this brings these cameras into Sony's XDCam Air portfolio, and there's some really exciting functionality coming with the XDCam Air range of services. Now, how is all this possible? Well, it's a modular camera. Let's talk a little bit about the codecs in this camera. So XAVC is the codec that we have, and XAVC and XAVC-S is in all of these cameras that we shoot with. In the F5 and 55, it's 10-bit 422 iframe in all modes, 4K, HD, UHD. It's level 5 H.264, and it uses something called variable bitrate, not variable bitrate encoding, but a frame analysis function. So every single frame that's encoded is individually examined, and the encoding of that frame, the way the codec works, is adjusted on a frame-by-frame basis. And this gives it a real quality advantage over other similar H.264 codecs that don't have that process. The files are significantly smaller than ProRes, so that means your archiving is much, much easier. And archiving 4K, big files anyway, if they're a little bit smaller thanks to XAVC, that's a huge help. It's much quicker to back up your media, to create your archive, easier to save lots of files. We also now have a new type of XAVC, which is class 480. Now, class 480 increases the bit rate and increases the quality. So now, if you want something even better than Sony's existing XAVC, which is very good, you can go to class 480. And I'm now starting to use this as a delivery format for my productions because it's still smaller than ProRes, but I can't tell the difference between this and ProRes. It's a really good, high-quality codec producing nice, compact files. In the other cameras, the versions of XAVC that we have can be either long GOP or iframe, depending on the camera. So in the FS5, as an example, we have XAVC-L, which is a long GOP version. Why XAVC-L in that camera? Well, it records onto SD cards, really low-cost media, so we need compact files. In UHD, it's 100 megabits per second, so these are nice, easy, compact files. The only downside, there's no free lunch with this stuff, is because it's long GOP, you need a bit of extra processing power to decode it. So you need a reasonably good computer to work with it. So the codec is very flexible. XAVC-S is long GOP as well, and we have lots of features coming with these cameras. Now, coming back to the F5 and 55 for a minute, the R7 RAW recorder, new addition to the range, was introduced last year. Log capture, when we shoot with log, there is some sacrifice of highlight information because each of our successively brighter stops is recorded with the same amount of data. Whereas in the real world, as you go up each stop, the actual light level doubles. Now, linear log actually uses twice as much data for each stop you go up. So nothing is lost. Absolutely nothing is given away. So we record the scene the way it really is, and that gives us phenomenal post-production flexibility. The F5 and 55 are 16-bit linear RAW, so a phenomenal amount of data. But RAW is very efficient, inherently efficient, because it isn't RGB. What we take is 4096 by 2160 pixels, and we record that. We record the pixel information, so one lot of 4K. A traditional camera recording RGB or YCB-CR, our normal compressed codecs, they have to record Y, 4096 by 2160. B or CB 4096 by 2160 and CR 4096 by 2160. The file size is 3 times bigger before you've done anything else. RAW, because it's just the pixel information, one lot of 4096 by 2160, and in the computer, in post-production, we turn it into a color picture, and at that point it does get much bigger. But when we record it, because it's that raw data, small, compact, really easy to work with, I can edit Sony's RAW on my laptop. So the other thing that we've got now, though, with the R7 is a new codec from Sony called XOCN. And this is really powerful, and I'll explain why in a moment. But we also have, with the R7, 4K at 120 frames per second, cache recording of up to 30 seconds, Dual card slots, so we can, when one card is full, it goes on to the next card, slightly smaller cards, and a splash-proof and dust-proof design. And I'm really looking forward to going out and shooting the storms that I shoot using the R7 with an f55 for that cache record function, so I can point the camera at a thunderstorm, wait for the bolt of lightning, then press record and capture the lightning, and also to shoot 4K at 120 frames per second to get some slow motion of the lightning. Now, XOCN, this is the Extended Tonal Range Original Camera Negative Codec. This is a way of recording 16-bit linear data, that direct data off the sensor in a compressed, in a way that is really easy to manage, very small. So it takes advantage of a unique algorithm that Sony have developed to make these files very compact. And in fact, the standard version of XOCN is 30% smaller than Sony's RAW, and Sony's RAW is already very efficient and very small. And then the light version is 60% smaller. It's actually smaller than ProRes. It's not much bigger than the XAVC codec, but we have 16-bit linear data. So you get that same post-production flexibility that you get with traditional RAW files, but with a compressed or an encoded recording that is no bigger than ProRes or even XAVC. So it's incredibly powerful. Really can push this in post. You can really do amazing things with it. The f55 camera is a little bit different from Sony's f5 in that it has the same color filters as the f65, so you get a beautiful color gamut. You get the same wide color gamut as the f65. You also don't have a rolling shutter. It has frame image scan, so there's no rolling shutter artifacts, so motion is captured with your verticals always nice and square. 14 stops of dynamic range, and that color gamut actually exceeds 2020. So we're able to record a bigger gamut than we actually need for even for HDR. This makes this camera particularly well suited for HDR productions, very, very high quality, and it's one of the preferred cameras now for Netflix for their HDR and 4K online productions. So XOCN, 16-bit RAW, and the amazing image quality dual card slots from the R7 that you get now. Now, to support that, there's a couple of new things coming this year, which is the AXS R1 card reader. This card reader is phenomenally fast. It uses Thunderbolt. If you record XOCN LT and you shoot for 25 minutes, that 25 minutes of footage you can transfer in 1 minute. With the right system. Obviously, you've got to have a pretty good hard drive or RAID array at the other end for the footage to go to, but that's how fast this thing is. It's blazingly fast. There's also the DVF EL200 viewfinder, new full HD resolution, extra brightness OLED viewfinder for the f5 and 55 cameras. Now, when you shoot with these cameras, S-Log3, RAW, whatever, it's really important that you get your exposure right. It's really vital that you do this properly. Now, a big dynamic range camera is going to capture highlights really, really well in a very different way to a traditional video camera. And it's really important to understand that in the real world, there isn't an infinite amount of light. We go outside on a nice sunny day like today, and yes, there is a lot of light, but it isn't infinite. So the light in the real world does fall off. And when you get to a camera that can record 14 stops, it's actually capturing that real-world fall-off of light. Now, a conventional video camera, your ordinary ENG cameras, things like that, they all use either a knee or a hypergamma or something like that to compress the highlights to increase the dynamic range, because this is what you see is what you get shooting. The mid-range has to look correct, but we can compress those highlights because generally the viewer won't notice that. But of course, if you overexpose with a conventional gamma curve, the picture doesn't look very good because the overexposure goes into the compressed part of the curve and it looks nasty. So the traditional TV cameraman might have heard the phrase or used the terminology, protect your highlights. If you're not sure about your exposure with a traditional camera, which way do you go? Well, you don't go up because it looks rubbish, you go down because a little bit dark, well, you can always brighten it up in post, but if you've overexposed, the highlights are gone, the skin tones might be falling apart, it's never going to look nice. But when we shoot with log, it's completely different. If you look at this diagram here for S-Log2 and S-Log3, you will see that there is no highlight roll-off whatsoever. It just goes up to clipping. Eventually, the picture does clip, but there's no roll-off in the highlights. But if you look at that diagram, where is the roll-off? Well, there's a roll-off in the shadows. If you underexpose these cameras, your image is going to be down at the bottom part of that curve where it rolls off. It's not going to look good. So with a log camera, you have to think completely differently. With a log camera, if you are unsure about your exposure, which way do you go? You go up, because it's not going to hurt you as much as going down will. Underexpose, you'll have muddy, noisy shadows. It's not going to look very nice. Your skin tones will get grainy. If you overexpose, the worst thing that's going to happen with a bit of overexposure is a few specular highlights might become clipped. Well, there's no TV currently made, even HDR ones, that can show those speculars accurately, so it's not going to hurt you. You don't need to worry about being a little bit overexposed. Stylized grading, film look, things like that. It's really hard on shadows. And it's the shadows and the mid-range of your shot that the audience will notice before they notice anything else. You look at this image here. Yes, those highlights on the water are blown out, but what you tend to look at first is the shadows on the backs of the actors' clothes. So it's really important to get those right. If I'd exposed this any darker, it would have been a very nasty shot. Now, I've got some examples of this from practical situation. And actually, for a note there, for HDR, getting your exposure right is vital. HDR, a screen like this, is very unforgiving of noise. When you increase the dynamic range of the display, you increase the display contrast. If you've got more contrast, if there's a little bit of noise in those shadows, you're going to see it because it's more contrasty. So do be careful about how you expose for HDR. Anyway, coming back to this. Cine Gamma 3, FS5, a challenging lighting situation. Let's say, imagine this is a church or a chapel. Maybe I'm doing a wedding video and the bride and groom are going to come out of that doorway. Well, we can see that this tree branch here has absolutely no texture or detail to it. It's black. The arch, the top of that arch, is very dark. But at the same time, I have some really nasty highlights. Just above the door, big area of overexposure. And on the far right, the brickwork is blown out. And that's with the Cine Gamma. And Cine Gammas do a really good job with high dynamic range. So I have a problem. How do I shoot something like this? No matter how I grade this, because of the highlight roll-off, those highlights are never going to look good. There's no information there. That gamma curve, the knee, has squashed it all together. There's no contrast in those highlights. They'll never look good. So what do I do? So here is an example. It's the same thing shot with log. And this is actually deliberately exposed about a stop and a half brighter than the Sony recommended numbers, and I'll give you those in a minute. And with the log footage, we can now see texture on the tree branch. We have a lot more shadow information. The archway where my bride and groom will be appearing is much, much brighter. So I do have more picture information. But hang on a minute. It still looks overexposed. And if you look at a waveform, yes, this is clipped. There is a lot of clipping just above that arch and also on the far right of the picture. The brickwork is clipped. But because this is log, because there's no highlight roll-off, there is still a lot of information in the clipped part of the image because it's not being squashed together. It's going up and up and up and clipping, but right to the point of clipping, there's still a lot of picture information. So when you grade it and you bring those levels down again, it's almost like a magic trick. We can now see all that brickwork. We can see the mortar. We can see the textures. So don't be worried about a bit of clipping in your picture when you shoot with log, because those highlights hang on really, really well. So don't be afraid of exposing a little bit brighter. Yeah, that little highlight above the door, it's still a little bit bright, but actually I believe that looks very natural because we can see it's a highlight. It looks like the real world. Another example here, S-Log2 again from the FS5. A difficult scene to shoot. This is in Dubai. And we have this incredible highlight of the sun shining off the reflective buildings on the other side of the street. We also have this billboard on this side of the street. Again, this is exposed hot. This is exposed about 1.5 stops above base, because if you look at the billboard, it's pretty noisy. If I'd have exposed that billboard any darker, putting less light on the sensor, it would have been even noisier. So I've overexposed bright, so we get, after post, a clean-looking billboard. But what about my highlights? Well, let's have a look what happens when you grade it. Well, we've got a nice, black, clean-looking billboard. The noise has gone away. But those highlights, they still look natural, even though they're heavily clipped, because you can see that they're dazzlingly bright. Now, I'm drawing your attention to them here, so you're concentrating on them, and maybe if you look hard enough, you think, oh, it doesn't look right. But because there isn't that highlight roll-off all the way to the clipping point, the footage looks good. So don't worry about clipping your footage a little bit if you shoot with log, especially if you're shooting for HDR, because actually you want to get a really good mid-range with a nice low noise level, because in HDR, if it's noisy, it's going to kill you. So these are Sony's base levels. I recommend you expose a little bit brighter than these, typically 1.5 to 2 stops over. And it's actually really easy. A white piece of paper, zebras at 70%, away you go. It's nice and simple. FS5 zebras at 70 will give you the right exposure. So to finish off, I'm going to show you the video that I showed at the beginning. This time there'll be a caption in the top right-hand corner that will tell you which camera shot each shot, so you'll find out which was done with which. I think there's a couple of shots in there that surprise people. They think it's probably done with one camera and it was shot with another. If you've got any questions you'd like to ask me, I'm going to be just behind here, just on the side of the booth after the video's shown, so you can come and ask me those questions. So enjoy the video. Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening.